I'm joined by the president of the NCAA, Dr. Mark Emmert. Mark, it's good to see you.
Good to be here.
We appreciate your being with us. At what point, since November, as the story and scandal began to play out, did you specifically recall thinking there's going to be a need here to step in with some extraordinary action by the NCAA?
Well, as you might recall, clear back in November, I sent a letter to the president of Penn State and indicated that while we weren't launching an official investigation, that we nonetheless had a number of questions that needed to be answered so that we could determine whether or not there was an appropriate role for the NCAA in all of this. And as the facts unfolded, both in the media but also through the criminal trials, and then of course through the Freeh report, it became clearer and clearer that this really demanded, not called for, but demanded a role for the NCAA. But it wasn't completely clear until that Freeh report came out that was so exhaustive and so thorough that it was obvious. Usually
NCAA enforcement issues are conducted, communications between the schools, and reporters would have to file an FOI, Freedom of Information, to find this. That letter that you wrote November 17th, you publicized. Why?
Well, because everyone was wondering what we were going to do and whether or not we had a role in all of this. We were getting constant inquiries both from the institution itself and of course from the media and the public at large as to whether or not there was a role for us to play there. And given that the fact pattern hadn't been established at that point, we truly didn't know. So in consultation with all of my staff and the executive committee, I determined that the most appropriate thing to do was just take that step, let them know where we were and what we were going to do, and let the public know of it as well, because this is unlike any other case we've ever dealt with. This is so public, so shocking, so disturbing that it called for a very different approach.
And the powers under which all this discipline was enforced and these penalties were laid on Penn State, are they still in effect? Is this back up on the shelf and you'd have to reapply and have another meeting with the board of directors and the executive committee, or do you still carry that on your tool belt?
Yeah, the way in which this played out is that I asked the executive committee, which is a group of university presidents from all three divisions of the NCAA, and also the Division I board, which represents all the conferences of Division I, to look at this in a very different light and to do as they've done in other cases in the past. This isn't the first time this has happened, but to give me the authority for just this case in a very prescribed, very narrow fashion.
And when was that?
It was formally last Saturday. We'd been talking about it all week long. I'd had multiple conversations with the full board and executive committee and then with the leadership of those boards, and then to actually take action on Saturday. So it's very confined. It's just this one act. If we were to do it again, we'd have to go back and start all over again.
Was it a case for Penn State basically sign that document, accept what we are telling you are the penalties, or there will be a death penalty of multiple years?
And no, it wasn't that at all. There's been some significant confusion.
Rod Erickson
I think,
pretty well
that
suggests that, though, doesn't he?
Well, you'll have to talk to President Erickson about that. But the fact is that we, when I say we, I mean myself, the executive committee, and the D1 board. So this is a group of more than 20 people. The death penalty was unequivocally on the table. It was widely discussed. There was a lot of sentiment that that ought to be one of the variables in a package of penalties. It was never a consideration that it would be by itself. We made clear that we had really two options in front of us: to go down this road, this consent decree model, or to launch a traditional investigation, and the time and energy, of course, that would consume for all parties with an unknown outcome. There was no doubt that the death penalty was an active option. Penn State's behavior and the actions taken by the president and by the board clearly were considerations among all of us in not applying the death penalty. So had Penn State not been as forthright and open about this, had Penn State not been as decisive as they were, I don't know what the outcome would have been, but I suspect it would have been significantly worse.
How does something like this happen?
Well, that's the question that the whole country is asking, isn't it? Penn State is a remarkable university, has extraordinary students and faculty. They've done wonderful things in the past. They'll do wonderful things in the future, but something went awry here where it lost sight of its core values on this despicable issue here. And what we're trying to do with these sanctions isn't just penalize and punish the school, but help them reshape that culture so that they never say the culture of hero worship or the culture of sport is ever going to overwhelm our values again, so that we don't make the right choice at the right time.
Why are you certain this is a cultural problem, an imbalance between priorities between athletics and academics, and not just a series of bad decisions by 4 guys over the course of 10 plus years?
Well, it could well be, but you have to say, how could that happen? And when you look at
it's the football's fault. That's basically what you've said.
Well, no, I think that would be a wrong conclusion.
Well, the reverence for Penn State football permeated every level of the university.
Yes.
That's from the consent decree.
Yes.
So you've laid it at the foot of the way people basically genuflected in front of Joe Paterno's program.
Certainly in front of the athletic department, and clearly when you look at the facts and the conclusions that we all reached in looking at the data that was delivered, the objective data in the Freeh report, we concluded that indeed that culture had gotten out of control, and it is the culture of big football that allowed, at least in part, this to occur.
Where isn't there great reverence for football programs at major schools, the top 25 or 30? Doesn't that exist pretty much everywhere?
Yeah, well, it's in many places, of course, and I've been a happy participant in that, and with some great success on the field and in the classrooms. But, you know, reverence for the sport or enjoyment of the sport and loving what it brings to a university isn't in and of itself the problem. It's when that allows you or supports the loss of value and focus on what's really important. Yeah, I read today a storyline that the sentiment of which has been reflected in a number of stories. It said yesterday was the darkest day in Penn State's history. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, you know, that's sort of a symptom of the difficulty here. That was a very, very bad day for Penn State University, but it wasn't as dark as a day boys were being abused on their campus. It wasn't as dark a day as when their former assistant coach was convicted. It wasn't as dark a day as any number of tragedies that they may have endured on that campus. It can't be the darkest day in the history of this grand university when what happened was the football team lost scholarships and lost 4 games in bowl games. That's a problem, but that's not the darkest day in the history of a university.
But you talk about the cultural issue and trying to send a message with these penalties to Penn State. 13 years ago, when you were the chancellor at LSU, you made a change in coach, firing Jerry DiNardo, bringing in Nick Saban. And at the press conference, you said, simply put, success in LSU football is essential for the success of Louisiana State University. Someone reading that might say, well, how does that square with keeping things in balance, academics and athletics?
Sure, it all depends upon your definition of success. So for me, success in college sports has never been just about winning. At the time that Nick Saban came in, we also had the lowest graduation rate in the SEC. And by the time he left LSU, it was one of the highest graduation rates in the SEC. We had young men getting in all kinds of off the field problems at LSU before he showed up, and by the time he left, we had virtually none of those. So when you look at success, in my mind, it means you play competitively, and of course you want to win. We all love that. But it also means kids are being students, they're graduating, kids are doing the things that young men are supposed to do when they're playing that game, or they're not going to be part of the program, and they're behaving as part of the university. And I think
they were doing all that at Penn State, except the people above them weren't shepherding this issue correctly, right?
Well, that certainly appears to be the case, sure.
We appreciate your time, Mark Emmert. Thank you for stopping by.
My pleasure.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.